Welcome to the Life Coach University's Pay It Forward platform, where coaches from around the world have gathered to coach millions more. We just want you to join us in paying it forward. We don't care how you do it. We just want to create the biggest ripple effect of gift giving the world has ever seen. And it all starts with each one of us just giving back in our own communities. So you could pay it forward in any way, shape, or form you want. You could use the teachings that you get here today to make your life a little bit better. You could teach somebody else. You could share Life Coach University with somebody. You could hug somebody. You can make somebody laugh. You can buy somebody lunch. Just as long as you join us in paying it forward and making this the kind of world that we want to live in. And that's one filled with joy, peace, love, and more meaningful connection. I just want to thank you for being you. You are simply amazing. You joined up, you showed up here today, and that's great. And now let's dive into today's topic. Before we do, during this thing, if you have a question, you can put it in the Q&A box. I will hopefully be paying attention to that and get to it as soon as possible. I will be pausing in between a couple of the sections here today to ask if anybody's got any questions on what I just went over. But anyway, so let's dive in. My name is Bryan Peterson again. I am a life coach with Achieve, Grow, Succeed Coaching, and I help people create an exercise program for their mental muscles so that they could stop self-sabotaging in their lives and experience more success instead. Today, we are talking about the ego versus the self-esteem. What's the difference? What's the fine line? How do we navigate the fine line in between? And broke it up into a couple sections today. I want to talk about first what the false ego is versus the real ego, and then what is a healthy ego is basically a healthy self-esteem. And so I want to talk a little bit on how we build a healthy self-esteem. Okay, so the first thing I want to share with you to burst my own ego bubble is I'm not like 100% prepared like I normally am for these. Normally, I've got all my ducks in a row. I want it to look perfect. My ego is always telling me when you watch the replay, you're going to find things that you did wrong and stuff like that. And in this case, I didn't get as prepared as I want. I normally practice this in front of the mirror to make sure I'm saying all the things right. But I wanted to share that with you today because in one of the ways in which we build a healthier self-esteem is that we practice humility. Be willing to admit our own mistakes, be willing to be vulnerable so that we have an opportunity to grow. Because often having uh, a big ego or that ego kind of gets in the way with that, which we're going to discuss here in a little bit. Anyway, I just wanted to share that so that I'm actually walking the walk and not just talking the talk, so to speak. Okay, so let's dive in. The definition of ego, for wherever I got this from, and I used the definition that kind of fit in what we're talking about here more, and it's an exaggerated sense of self-importance. And this is what I'll refer to as the false ego, right? So we're exaggerating our own importance, right? The self-esteem definition that I want to use today for our healthy self-esteem is your overall sense of personal value and self-worth. It's a feeling of satisfaction that somebody has in themselves and their own abilities. So it's kind of like how we feel about ourselves, right? And are we confident or not? So what's the difference between what I just mentioned, the false ego versus the real ego, right? So when somebody has a healthy self-esteem, they have the confidence to do what they know they're capable of, whereas somebody with a big ego thinks that they know everything and that they're unwilling to accept any criticism or suggestions. And what mostly people refer to as the false ego, or the ego, is what I'm going to refer to as the false ego. Uh, the real ego is your very essence. It's it's the consciousness that makes us aware and awake to reality, right? It's who we are as human beings, who we are as a person. That's our real ego. And so when I'm referring to that, I'm going to call that either the healthy ego or the healthy self-esteem. Okay, so the healthy ego is in alignment with who we are. It's being us, being authentic. While the false ego is an identity that is crafted to preserve a sense of being the most significant, right? The most important, the one who knows it all, right? So we want to have a healthy, or our healthy ego equals the healthy self-esteem. Your false ego is like wearing armor that's made of paper, but you think it's made of iron. So when you go out into the world, anybody that attacks you, you're open to being easily wounded, right? Those a friend's words that are just casual words might cut deeper because it's going through that paper as opposed to what you think is iron. Okay. So let's dive in. If anybody has any questions, like I said, just put them in the chat box or in the Q&A. Okay, so the first part of the thing I'm going to go through is how the false ego plays a role in our lives, what it does, and basically kind of how it hinders us and how it holds us back. And then the second part of this, I'm going to talk about actually building a healthy self-esteem and what that looks like. Okay. So your ego is like a mask. It's like this. Then there was a movie out there, The Mask, but it's like putting on that Halloween mask as a kid and hiding who you are. And, like a lot of kids today will wear that superhero mask. So this is kind of like the same thing. Like we're kind of like pretending we're like a superhero in a way when we're just a mere mortal. And in our effort to present ourselves as the greatest and smartest, we actually are hiding who we truly are. So there's this gap between who we really are, who we want to be, and then somewhere in that gap is how we present ourselves to the public, right? And even when we're presenting ourselves, there's a variety of personas that come up. Like we present ourselves in different ways. Like if we're talking to our spouse, we might act a little bit differently than we were talking to, let's say, our best friend or just our regular friends or our coworkers or your family even. Okay. So, and I'm sure nobody wants to really admit it, but like you get on the telephone and you might be a little bit more polite, or like you're talking to the sales guy at the whatever store, and you're like, yes, sir, no, sir. But at home, you may act a little bit differently. And why? Like, why do we do this? Because we want to be special. The ego wants to make us special. So the ego creates this false identity to appear more knowledgeable and more accomplished. And we do everything we can to protect that identity, right? The false ego wants like a big reaction, like to the clothes we wear. That's why we spend all this time getting dressed up, to our hairstyles. We want this big praise. The ego finds confidence and joy in impressing others, right? But the key is that you are actually you are who you really are when no one else is watching. So think about that. Like, what do you do when you're alone at home? You can take some time to reflect. Like, how do I act when nobody else is around? Like, I work from home now, and I used to work in restaurants for like 35 years, and it's a little bit different in here when I'm sitting at home trying to hold myself more accountable. Like I want to be this productive guy all day long, but I do take breaks and I do spend time on social media, maybe when I shouldn't, but that's actually who I am. Okay. So we just want to make sure that we understand that your false ego is putting on a mask. Okay. And the false ego, it makes us liars. So in order to protect that identity, we tend to lie or exaggerate. And I know none of you have ever done this, but for me, like a big one, like I remember one of my first coaches that I hired, on his intake packet, he had a question on there and it said, basically the question was like, what are you going to lie to me about? And I thought, oh my God, that's like a very bold question. But I thought I need to be honest here. And so I put that I'm going to say I understand something when I don't. And it was actually really good because it helped me get better coaching. But that's what we do a lot of times, right? Like if somebody says, oh, does that make sense? You're like, oh, yeah, it makes sense. And in your head, you're like, I have no clue what they're talking about. So that kind of puts a barrier, like we're pretending to be like, here's who we are and here's who we want to be. So we're pretending to be somebody else, right? And I got this. A lot of this information that I got today, by the way, is from Jay Shetty's book, Think Like a Monk. In fact, what inspired me to do this was when I was reading the chapter that he wrote on ego. So there's a lot of good information in there, and I took that. He said there was a story that he heard about Jimmy Kimmel, and I don't watch Jimmy Kimmel, but he does something called the Lie Witness News, and they were interviewing people outside of Coachella, which is this big musical and arts festival. And they were interviewing these people, and they made up a bunch of fake bands, fake music bands, and then they asked the people about them. And the people, instead of just admitting that they didn't know that that band didn't exist, they started pretending to know the band and proceeded to make up stories. And I probably had a delivery. Woo! Welcome to real life. Oh, that's too funny. Anyway, uh, they started to make up stories about who the band was and their opinions of the band. Like, oh, I really think they're going to put on a good show, right? So their egos took control to prevent them from looking like a fool, like AKA not knowing what's going on about the bands, but actually made them look more like a fool in the end, right? So that's what happens to us when we let the ego get out of control. It ends up crashing down on us, and the house of cards kind of implodes eventually. The ego also creates false hierarchies. And when I say this, the ego goes to great length to put other people down. So if people are less than us, that means that we're more special, right? And that means not necessarily we're better than them, but uh, like our building is taller than theirs, so to speak. And we rank ourselves, we rank everything, like our physical attributes. You know, am I stronger or weaker than that person? Our education, you know, what's my education like versus yours? Our net worth, our race, our religions, our cars, our houses, our friends, our accomplishments. Like we're always ranking ourselves with all these things, right? So throughout this process today, I'm going to ask you to take a couple moments to reflect, like to reflect on your own lives. In what ways do you compare yourself to others? Like in what ways are you ranking where you live as compared to other places? It may not be where you live, but what is it for you? Like just being aware of these things that I'm discussing in here will help you in identifying if you're building a healthy self-esteem versus an out of control ego. Okay. Let's see. The ego always also makes us judgmental. So even without ranking ourselves, like we tend to judge other people as a means to elevate ourselves. Like we may have the same car, the ranking is the same, right? But to make ourselves a little bit better, you're going to say, oh, yeah, Steve may have the same car as me, but you know what? Steve's a jerk and I'm nice. So I'm a little bit taller in this case, right? So we often pass judgment like this to deflect away from the shortcomings of ourselves, like the things that we don't like about ourselves. This is a lot of people will call this projecting or mirroring. And this is a tendency to project or mirror our emotions or feelings onto others that we don't wish to deal with ourselves. So another moment of reflection for you. Like in what ways when you're having a discussion with somebody else and you notice you're starting to judge a little bit, ask yourself, like, if I'm judging this person for being dishonest, I think they're dishonest. In what ways I'm actually dishonest myself, right? Open up your eyes to that. If I think somebody's being irresponsible, in what ways am I being irresponsible in my own life? Because we're only seeing in other people what we actually see in ourselves. So a lot of times when I catch myself judging, instead of bashing myself for judging, even what I'll do is I'll say, "Oh, wow, like you really think that that person is they're not like let's say irresponsible," and so I just dive into my own stories, and it kind of brings my humility down a little bit. okay? So just think, how might I be projecting my own insecurities and my own weaknesses on this person? So the ego, the false ego, is also an obstacle for growth. And I kind of alluded to this earlier. So in our efforts to construct a for straw, see, here we go. my brain is saying you should have practiced more. So in our efforts to construct a facade, it actually distracts us from learning and growing. And so how does it do this? Like if you're listening to a conversation with your friends and you're just chomping at the bit to tell your fabulous story, or in my case, I was always looking for that witty response, you might be missing out on absorbing what the essence of what was truly being said. Like they may be having like this great conversation, and there could be a lesson involved in it there, and yet you're missing it entirely because all you're worried about is getting your funny story out, right? So take a moment to reflect. Hang on. Take a moment to reflect on some of these questions when you're engaged with other people. Are you ashamed or grateful when you discover that you're wrong about something? Like, in a conversation, let's just say with my wife, when I say something and she's like, oh, no, 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 that's not right. I just looked it up the other day and here's the case. Okay, so am I ashamed? Do I get, oh, embarrassed? Or am I grateful? I'm like, oh, thank you for pointing that out, because one of them allows you to learn, the other one just basically makes you want to inflate your ego even more, right? So you can ask this question too: are you defensive or intrigued when you find information that contradicts something you believe in? Now, I see this a lot with politics. I don't want to jump into politics on here. That's not my intent. But there's a lot of times that this side over here will say something and post some facts, and this side over here, because it doesn't go, it contradicts what they believe, they could either get defensive about it or they can get intrigued. Most of the time, they get defensive and they dig in even further on their stance. When in actuality, if they would just be intrigued, like, okay, let me think about this, let me question this, they might actually grow a little bit more, right? So if we aren't open minded, we tend to deny ourselves opportunities to learn, grow, and change. Okay, so the ego is also what I would call a double-edged sword. Um, when our weaknesses are exposed, the ego, that ego that told us that we were brilliant and successful, like has no defense. Like you finally realize that it's paper armor instead of actual armor. Um, so an example of this might look like you said you were good at sales to get the job, right? To the new employer, you said you were really good at sales, but when it comes down to actually making sales, like your true abilities show through and then kind of show that you're not. Okay, so egoism often masks a low self-esteem in ourselves, but then eventually transforms to even in a lower self-esteem, because now we're like, okay, they truly see who I am, and now I feel even worse about myself for lying in the first place or for exaggerating in the first place, right? Because it's never lying, it's just exaggerating, right? The ego is also two-faced. I love this one too. Like in one moment, our ego is telling us, you are the best. Like you're the best at this, Brian. You're really good at this. And in the next moment, the ego's like, you suck. Like you're the worst. Your ego either wants to be the best or it wants to be like worse. Like if you've got a story, somebody else is telling a story about how bad they had it off, your ego wants to say, oh no, I had it. I'm even worse than that. So your ego just wants to go to those two extremes, right? But the true humility lies somewhere in between that, lies somewhere in between that gap of who you are, really are, and then who you're presenting. And I always like to say, if we can shrink that gap a little bit, and the more we shrink it, the less room we have for that anxiety of not portraying this false identity, so to speak. And I think that's where a lot of people get ashamed and experience anxiety in public. It's just because they're afraid that people are going to actually see themselves as who they really are, right? And I want you to think about this too. Let me make sure there's no questions. You're not really the best, but you're not really the worst either, right? So anytime we get into compare and despair, as one of my mentors like to call it, that's when we truly set ourselves up for negative results, right? The only person you should be comparing yourself against is you. Like, here's where I was at yesterday, here's where I'm at today. Maybe tomorrow I'm back over here, but that's it. Just look at yourself and look at your own growth, right? Because there's always going to be somebody better than you, and there's always going to be somebody worse. And that's just neutral. That's just the facts. That's not things to inflate our ego, saying that we're better than somebody, or to lower our self-esteem either. Okay, so that, oops, I got a question. Perfect. I was just getting ready to ask. I got two of them now. Okay, so hang on a second. Let me look at this. Somebody just asked, what if you don't like what you uncover about yourself when you do this work? Hey, that's a great question. But here's the deal, right? You may not like it, but what can you do about it now? Like, how can I change it? Like, if you didn't uncover it in the first place, you would just continue to walk around with something you didn't like about yourself. Like, you're just carrying a 50-pound weight that you don't care to carry around. So if you don't like it, I would just take the opportunity to explore. Like, what don't I like about it? Is the gap too big between who I want to be, and who I really am? If so, what are some ways that I can change it? Part of what I'm going to discuss in the next session on building a healthier self-esteem will kind of give you some answers to this as well. But that's a great question. Thank you. Another one said, I know I judge my partner for what I see as wasting time. I get angry and even resent this because I then feel that my job is being wasted. I struggle with this because then I want to change my partner. I judge myself for getting angry. What's my ego trying to tell myself here? So just like your great question, by the way. Just like you're seeing that your partner is wasting time. I think your ego at this point, uh, or the message is like, how am I wasting my time? I'm not comfortable with how I deal with my time. That disappoints me. And so I'm going to reflect this, and that's what we call the mirror or projecting, is I'm going to reflect this back on this other person, and I'm going to judge them for that. So one of the ways of experience humility is looking at ourselves and seeing our own ways for what we are. I struggle with this because that I want to change my partner. You want to change, what you really do is what you're really doing here is you're really wanting to change yourself. You're just resistant to it. Your ego is saying, I don't need to change. They need to change. So if you just kind of turn it inward and say, what am I wasting time, and why am I angry about that? And that could help you. But thank you. And we have another one here. How do you tell someone to be more humble without being rude? His ego is pretty big. I don't know. That's a fine line one. I always like to bring it back to myself. What can I do? What can I demonstrate? The circle of control that I have is just my own thoughts, feelings, and actions. I control those. I can influence his. I can show him what it's like to be more humble. Uh, and stuff like that. That's a pretty tough one. That's going to be a fine line. Uh, Telling somebody the truth, right? That could be it, but without doing it like telling the truth in a much more kinder type of way. I'm struggling to come up with an example here. I do have an example later on of where you're in integrity in your values. And so when we get to that part, I'll remind you of that. But yeah, I mean, if telling the truth hurts somebody, it might he might just not want to jump out there and say, "Hey, I think your ego is too big" or whatever like that. Um, you know, just subtle reminders on, "Hey, we're all human." That might help out. But thank you. That's another great question. Okay, so all righty. Any more before we jump into how to build a healthy self-esteem? Okay. And let's just jump right in then. Okay, so I have alluded to a few things you can do while I was discussing the false ego to help you build that self-esteem, which is becoming more aware, right? Asking yourself questions in these in certain situations. But I wanted to share with you a couple more simple ways on how to grow a healthy ego or a healthy self-esteem, right? Because we want it healthy versus an inflated ego. So practicing awareness is one of them, and asking yourselves those questions, but also practicing humility. And I mentioned this a little bit before. So I took this exercise from the book Think Like a Monk by Jay Shetty again. And so try this mental exercise to become more aware of your ego on a daily basis. And the more aware we are of it, the more we can actually do something to change it, right? So Jay Shetty said that when he was training as a monk, they instructed him to do this every day. They said there are two things you should remember, and there are two things you should forget. And so the two things that they said you need to remember every day are you need to remember the bad things that we have done to other people and the good things that they have done for us. Now, why do we want to remember the bad things that we've done to other people, right? But by remembering the bad things that we've done to others, our egos are forced uh, to remember our imperfection and our regrets, right? They help us keep in line. We've got ourselves way up here, and they kind of help pull us back down a little bit and say, "Hey, look, you're not the perfect person that you're setting yourself up to be, or that you're telling everybody else that you are," right? And by remembering the good that's been done for us, we begin to feel humbled by the fact that we do need other people, because all those good things that were done for us were great and they helped us out. And not only that, but it gives us a gratitude for what we've actually received. So those are the two things that we should remember. And then the two things that we should forget are the opposite. We should forget the good things that we've done for others and the bad things they've done for us. So why should we forget the good things that we've done for others, right? Because this is the same thing. Like, but forgetting the good we've done for others, it helps keeps our ego in check, right? And not to buy into our own hype. So once again, that helps us reel ourselves in, so to speak, right? And by forgetting the bad that they've done to us, that allows us to learn how to forgive and let go, and to see that everybody else, we're all just human beings. Like, none of us are quote unquote perfect, right? We want to build confidence, not ego. Okay, so humility actually allows us to see our own strengths and weaknesses so we can actually learn and grow. And I had alluded to that earlier. Um, but okay, so I want to give you a few examples so that you kind of have an awareness of some thoughts and whether they're coming from your ego, your false ego, or whether they're coming from a healthy self-esteem. Okay, so the false ego uh, fears what other people have to say about them, whereas the self-esteem filters what other people have to say about them. So instead of getting feedback, let's say on a presentation you had, and fearing what that person's got to say, or you could filter it like, it's just constructive criticism, or like when your friend just says a couple casual words to you, but you take them as an attack. You could filter them and just say, hey, maybe my friend was having a bad day themselves, and that's why they said it. So a healthy self-esteem will actually filter that, right? The ego likes to compare itself to others, where the self-esteem just compares it to themselves. Remember, we talked about the compare and despair earlier. So instead of comparing yourself against others and measuring yourself against somebody that you don't even know their circumstances, don't know anything about their story, and you're comparing themselves, social media is really, really bad about this, right? You can just compare yourself to where you're at, right? The ego wants to prove itself, whereas the self-esteem wants to be themselves, right? That's a really good one. The ego wants to know everything. It wants to be a know-it-all rather than the self-esteem who thinks it can learn from anybody, like in any given situation. I'll give you an example that every time I'm in a coaching session with somebody, I always thank them for learning something about myself too. There could be any situation that you can ask yourself, what can I learn? What's the lesson in it here for me, right? The ego pretends to be strong. I love this one where the self-esteem is okay to be vulnerable. Kind of like at the beginning when I was willing to admit that I wasn't 100% prepared. It was bothering me because I've got this, the ego part of me wants to say, you do everything right, you're perfect, and stuff like that, when in reality, I know that I'm not. So it actually kind of helps me there. The ego wants respect versus the self-esteem that actually respects self and others. Okay. All right. So one of my favorite ways, this is such a great analogy. I don't know who I got it from. I'm not taking credit for it, but use small will to build your healthy self-esteem. Use small wins to build your credit score with yourself. So this is the akin to making tiny promises to yourself that you can keep every day. And so when I learned this, like just like we have a credit score for our finances, right? We also have a credit score with ourselves. And so when we break those promises, I don't care if they're tiny or they're big, our credit score goes down and it goes down. And then we're not able to make withdrawals on it later on. So begin to ask yourself, uh, if whatever you're doing, saying, or whatever it is this raising my credit score with myself, or is this lowering my credit score with myself, right? Just like you could, if you've got a high financial credit score, you can get great loans and you can leverage things and buy a bigger house, let's say. If you have a higher credit score with yourself, you can make huge withdrawals from that. You can withdraw courage and confidence and self-assurance and pride, not the egoic kind of pride, but just a well-founded pride in what you've been doing. Okay. Another way that you can build your healthy self-esteem is be integrity with your values, right? Um, when you make an effort to live by your values and be integrity with them, you benefit not only you, but you also benefit the people around you. And what do I mean by this? Instead, and this goes back to, I think what I was talking about earlier when you asked the question, oh, how do you tell someone without being more, whose ego is pretty big? Uh, but instead of lying, oh, this was telling the truth. We were talking about telling the truth, right? So instead of lying to a friend and saying their presentation was the greatest when it really wasn't, and you value honesty, you get to tell them the truth and you feel better for being honest, and your friend actually gets the feedback that they really need to help them become a better person. And you're not just inflating their ego. Just imagine if you told them it was great and it wasn't, and the third, second, third, fourth, and fifth person told them this presentation was great and it really wasn't. They're going to go along thinking that presentation's great. They're not going to try to do anything to make it better. Okay. So living in integrity and alignment with your values also helps build that credit score up. Each time you're living inside of that value and integrity with it, that credit score grows. And you're also helping other people out. Like you're not pumping up their ego as well. Um, Another way to build a healthy self-esteem is to improve the relationship with yourself. Now, the Pay It Forward University, if you missed it in April, there was a conference on relationships. I highly recommend that you look it up and you watch the replay because they go they dive deep into everything about relationships. But for specifically this one here, I'm talking about improving the relationship with yourself. Uh, so what is the relationship like with yourself? Like, compare it to your relationship with your best friend. How do you and your best friend get along? What do you say to each other? You're always saying nice things to each other and stuff like that. Is your relationship with yourself like that? Like, do you say nice things to yourself or do you say mean things to yourself? Hang on. I noticed my Dallas Cowboys star was coming up on there. That's another thing we do when it comes to ego. We like to identify as certain things, like I'm a Dallas Cowboys fan. Anyway, um, so improving our relationships, yes. So just being aware of how you talk to yourself, how you treat yourself. Do you keep your promises? How hard on you? Like, is it like a parent-child relationship? Are you always commanding and telling yourself what to do? I like to look at the relationship with myself, whatever the voice is on my shoulder. Good Bryan, bad Bryan, both all of them are trying to we're trying to be a team, and when I look at it more like that way, I tend to get more done and I have further progress, but it also allows me to reel myself back in. uh, and then self compassion, like, do you have self compassion for yourself? Do you give yourself a break? Remember what we talked about before, like, we're all human, right? We all make mistakes. None of us are perfect. There's always somebody better, there's always somebody worse. We're not using that to judge ourselves. It's just the way it is, right? um, let's see. Another thing is self-esteem. So low self-esteem comes with a lot of negative self-talk. Like we say, like, I'm not good enough. You'll never be good enough. You're not smart enough. You're not talented enough. And all these things. So one of the things that we can do to help boost our self-esteem is challenge that negative self-talk. And so how does that look? It's a simple process. Like, you think the thought, you hear yourself saying it. You can journal. I like journaling about it. That really helps me. So I'll write it down. I'm not good enough. And then I ask myself one very simple question. Is it 100% true? So is it 100% true that I'm not good enough? Well, no, it's not, right? So if it's not true, then what is? Now I'm able to see the ways in which I am good enough, which is a much better feeling to have than thinking I'm totally not good enough. And here's the kicker, even if it is true, now what? We'll go back to the very first question. Even if it is true, like, what if I don't like what I uncover about myself when I do this work? Well, if it is true, now what? Well, now I've got a golden opportunity to do something about it. And I always like to ladder my beliefs. So if I'm down here on the bottom rung of the ladder, which is I'm no good, or I'm not good enough, and I want to get up to I can do anything, I just start crawling up that ladder. What's the next rung on the ladder? It could be, can somebody else do it? Oh, yeah. Then I climb up to that one. Can I learn how to do it? Can I learn to be better? Yes. Can I get better skills? Can I buy a book? Could I look things up on the good old world wide web? Yes, I can, right? So that's another one. Challenge those negative thoughts. The more you challenge them, think of it as like a table, okay? And here is your negative thought about yourself. And so when you start challenging it, you start knocking out table legs. And every time you knock it out, you knock it out. Eventually, that table falls, right? And then you could take the new. If that wasn't true, you could take what is true, your next thought, your next belief, and you can start putting table legs underneath that. I call that the finding evidence muscle when it comes to your mental muscles. And then the last thing I want to share with you when it comes to boosting your, uh, see, this is what practice, like, if I would have practiced, I would have done a better job. That's too funny. I could tell you what, I could laugh at myself, somebody else. I could just laugh at any given time. It's too funny. So the last thing that I'm going to share with you is change the story or the narrative, right? Because the story you're telling yourself about yourself, or the story you're telling yourself about the situation in front of you, it's only negative because you gave it a negative meaning. And that's it. Plain and simple. Like, literally, like, all of our thoughts are just made up anyway. And I know maybe that comes as a surprise, but if they're just made up, why not change them into something that's going to serve you better? Like, why make it that I'm going to bring, I did a workshop yesterday, the first time doing a workshop on Google Meet. And Calendly, I had major problems um, long story short, there wasn't too much that went well about this workshop. Uh, I could make the narrative that I suck, that I'm too stupid to learn how to use Google Meet, or how to get Calendly to link up with this, or how to put links in Facebook to get people to sign up, and all this BS. I could do that, but that doesn't serve me very well. And so I told my wife, I said, I just had to chuckle and laugh at how many things were going wrong because I took responsibility for it. I'm like, okay, I did it, but I can learn from it. So what if I do is I change the story. I change the story to, look, here are some things that happened. It doesn't mean that I'm a failure. It means that I failed at a couple of things, but I'm not a failure myself. So I changed the story. Uh, think of think of the thoughts that your brain is handing you is just like a buffet of food, right? You wouldn't go into a buffet and just hand your plate to the server and just say, "Hey, go fill it up with whatever." No, no, you wouldn't do that. You're going to end up with a plate full of stuff you hate, right? And I always use a Chinese buffet. I don't know why, just because I guess I've been to a lot of Chinese buffets. But take the food that you like a lot. For me, that's Mongolian beef. And take a food that you don't like, crab rangoon. And I don't know what they might be for you, right? So when your brain just naturally starts handing you these thoughts or these stories, you could take that plate and say, no, I don't want, like Bryan, I don't want crab rangoon today, and I can dump it out. I can clean off my plate, and I can fill my own plate up with Mongolian beef. I get to choose my own thoughts, right? I get to change that story. I get to change the narrative. And when I change that story and I change that narrative, it just empowers me. It makes me realize that I'm not as bad as my ego wants to make me out and believe it is. Did it suck? Having a horrible workshop and being a quote unquote coach, that's one of my favorite ones too. It's like being a life coach. And how many times does my ego expect me to know something or to be better at something because I know about it, right? So I have to deal with that one a lot. But I'm very, um, just over the course of the years have done enough studies and have done enough things where I can humble myself, and I realize that gap between who I really am and who I present myself. I still want to be this guy over here, right? But I've shrunk that gap between uh, who I really am and who I present, and now I have less anxiety about uh, being inauthentic and things like that. Uh, so in a nutshell, the false ego just likes to create this exaggerated identity of yourself, right? It's this inflated version of yourself. And creating a healthier self esteem basically just gets you into an alignment with who you actually really are as a person. Okay. And that's it. Do I have any questions today for that part on any of it that I went over? Ah, well, this was actually a little bit more fun today because I got to just be myself instead of do this. I always kind of follow along with my script, and I at least had my outline prepared. But I just want to thank you for showing up once again. And once again, you are amazing. You showed up here today. That speaks volumes about wanting to help yourself and help move your journey forward. And maybe you came here with the intention of thinking you had an ego problem, or maybe you came here with the intention of thinking somebody else had an ego problem. But either way, I hope that you learned what a false ego looks like, and then ways in which you could build a healthier ego. Uh, Somebody put thank you for a great session. Hey, you're welcome. Thank you. I really love this stuff. It's fun. I'm really shocked that my cat climbed into a box earlier, and I thought for sure that cat's going to jump out of that box, but instead I got a doorbell. Huh, who knows? So anyway, let's wrap this up. My name is Bryan Peterson once again, and I am with a life coach with Achieve, Grow, Succeed Coaching. I help people build a program to exercise their mental muscles. I always picture my brain just doing these lifts. Anyway, so that they can stop self-sabotaging and actually create the success they want. And once again, I'd like to remind you that this was brought to you by the Life Coach University and their Pay It Forward platform, where coaches from around the world have gathered to help coach millions more. We don't care how you pay it forward, just as long as you join us um, in creating the biggest ripple effect of gift giving the world has ever seen. You could do it by using the coaching, teaching somebody what you learned today. In fact, that's the best way to learn it, is to teach somebody, by the way. Um, Make somebody laugh, buy somebody lunch, just be kind to somebody today. All we ask is you just pay it forward and join us in making the world the type of place that we want to live in, one filled with more peace, joy, love, and meaningful connection. Once again, you are amazing. You have an absolutely wonderful, wonderful day. Bye.